The woman on her knees scrubbing their floors was their son's legal wife. They didn't know that. They had never looked at her long enough to know anything. To the Shin family, Natasha was the help. The new housemaid from Nigeria who arrived on a Tuesday morning with 2 suitcases, a reference letter, and the kind of quiet that powerful people mistake for submission. She was 27. She was beautiful in the way that made certain women in that house uncomfortable without them knowing exactly why. She scrubbed their imported Italian marble on her hands and knees. She served their meals without being invited to speak. She pressed their clothes and polished their silverware and absorbed their casual cruelties the way a river absorbs rain, without comment, without expression, without anything that could be pointed to and called a reaction. For 6 weeks, she did this. For 6 weeks, she listened. She learned the architecture of this family, who held the real power, who owed what to whom, where the bodies were buried and which closets they were behind. For 6 weeks, the Shin family mocked the woman who could have destroyed them with a single phone call. And on the 43rd day, she made it. But we are not starting there. We are starting at the beginning, because the beginning is the only place this story makes complete sense. And once you understand the beginning, you will understand exactly why Natasha did not make that call sooner. Stay with me. 18 months before Natasha arrived at the Shin family compound with her 2 suitcases and her silence, she was in Lagos. Not struggling, not desperate, not the version of an African woman that certain stories require before they can begin. She was a corporate attorney at 26, sharp, trained in international business law, the kind of woman who read contracts the way other people read novels, finding the story in the margins, the tension in the clauses, the betrayal buried in the fine print. She had built that career alone. Her father had died when she was 14. Her mother had raised 4 children on the salary of a secondary school teacher and the particular brand of iron love that does not announce itself because it is too busy working. Natasha had watched her mother and decided, very early, that she would become the kind of woman who could never be made helpless. Not by circumstance, not by someone else's decision, not by anything. She had almost succeeded. Then Kim Yi-won walked into her life. Not romantically, professionally. He was a senior partner at a Korean firm with significant holdings in West Africa, and he needed legal counsel on a joint venture agreement that had started to look, as he put it, structurally complicated. Natasha was assigned the case. They worked together for 4 months, 12-hour days across time zones, video calls at midnight, documents sent back and forth with margin notes that started professional and slowly, over those 4 months, became something else, something warmer, something that read more like conversation than correspondence. He was 63 years old. He was not her love interest, but he was, in the way of certain older men who have made every mistake available to them and come out the other side, genuinely kind. The kind of kind that doesn't need an audience. And he was dying. She found out on a Thursday. Not from him. He didn't tell her directly. She found out the way she found out most things, by reading carefully between the lines of a document that was only superficially about something else. He was restructuring his personal assets, moving holdings, updating beneficiaries, the particular paperwork of a man who is making sure that when he is gone, the things he built do not become weapons in other people's hands. She called him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, pancreatic, 6 months, possibly less." She said, "I'm sorry." He said, "I need to ask you something that you are absolutely allowed to refuse." His son was named Shin Du-chul. Everyone called him Chul. He was 29 years old, the only heir to the Shin Global Group, and he was, by his own father's private and pained admission, in danger. Not physically, financially, legally, the kind of danger that doesn't make news until it is too late. Yi-won explained it carefully, the way a man explains something he has been turning over in his mind for a long time and has finally accepted the shape of. The Shin family, Chul's maternal grandmother, his uncle, 2 cousins who had spent the last decade positioning themselves carefully, had been quietly building a legal case. They had found, in the original incorporation documents of Shin Global, a clause. An inheritance clause that Yi-won's own father had written in 1987, back when the company was a fraction of what it had become, back when family succession meant something different. The clause stated that the primary heir must be married before assuming full executive control. Not just named. Actually married, with documentation, with a witness, with the legal record to prove it. It was an old clause, a relic. No one had looked at it in 30 years. Until the Shin relatives found it. And found out that Chul, who was famously, deliberately, almost philosophically single, who had publicly stated in 2 separate interviews that marriage was not part of his plan, not now, possibly not ever, was not married. Which meant that if Yi-won died before Chul married, the clause would activate. Control of Shin Global would not pass cleanly to Chul. It would go into a board vote. A board that the Shin relatives had spent a decade quietly populating with people who owed them favors. Chul would lose the company his grandfather built. Unless he was married first. Natasha listened to all of this without interrupting. Then she said, "And you want me to be the wife?" Yi-won said, "I want to offer you the choice, with full transparency about what it would mean and full freedom to refuse." She said, "Why me?" He said, "Because I have watched you work for 4 months, and you are the most precise person I have met in 40 years of business. And because the thing my son needs is not a romantic partner. He needs someone who understands contracts, who understands that this is a legal arrangement with legal terms and legal protections. Someone who will not be destroyed by the Shin family's particular way of doing things, because she has already read the clause and knows exactly where she stands." He said, "I am not asking you to love my son. I am asking you to protect him, and I am offering you something in return." The something was significant. A settlement specified in the contract should the marriage dissolve after Yi-won's death. A number that represented more financial security than Natasha's career would produce in a decade, possibly 2. And a clause, her own addition, her own insistence, non-negotiable, that she would have complete legal standing throughout, that no one could strip her of her rights, that the marriage, however it had begun, would be documented and binding. She took 3 days. Then she signed. The wedding was private. A Thursday afternoon in a government registry office in Seoul. A witness on each side. A judge who read the vows from a laminated card. Natasha in a dark blue dress she had bought that morning. Chul in a gray suit that fit him the way expensive clothes fit people who have never had to think about money. He shook her hand after the judge pronounced them married. He shook her hand. She looked at his face when he did it, trying to read what was underneath. She found nothing, not cruelty, not contempt, just the absolute sealed composure of a man who had been told what he needed to do and had done it and was now filing it away and moving on. His father cried, quietly in the corner. That was the only emotion in the room. On the way out, Chul said 3 things to her. He said the arrangement would be handled discreetly. He said her account would be credited as agreed. And he said that he did not expect anything from her that was not in the contract. She said, "Neither do I." He nodded and got into a car. She stood on the pavement outside the registry office in Seoul, legally married to a stranger, and thought, "I have read harder contracts than this man." She had no idea what she was walking into. Yi-won's plan had been for Natasha to be introduced to the Shin family as his son's wife immediately after the marriage. A clean reveal. A legal fait accompli that would neutralize the inheritance clause before anyone had time to mount a challenge. He died 11 days after the wedding. Not the 6 months the doctors had projected. 11 days. It was fast. It was sudden. And it was the thing that none of them, not Yi-won, not the lawyers, not Natasha, had actually planned for. Because in those 11 days, Yi-won had become sicker than he let anyone know. And Chul had spent those 11 days at the hospital. And the wedding documents had been filed, but not yet disclosed. And the one person who had the full picture of the plan and the timing and the intended announcement was the man now lying in a hospital room in Seoul, and then the man in a casket, and then a name on a headstone. The Shin relatives moved within 48 hours of the funeral. They filed the challenge before the will had finished being read. Chul's lawyers found out on a Friday evening. Natasha found out on a Saturday morning, when Chul appeared at the door of the modest apartment his father had arranged for her. She had been living separately, as agreed, the marriage entirely private, and stood in her doorway with his jacket in his hand, and his face showing the particular expression of a man who is holding himself together by a very thin thread. He said, "The timeline has accelerated." She said, "I know, I saw the filing." He stared at her. She said, "I have alerts on court filings. I read the document this morning." He said, "The lawyers think there's a strategy. If you come to the house, if the family sees that the marriage is real, that it has been real, that there is no basis for the challenge." She said, "You want me to move into the compound?" He said, "It would need to look." She said, "How long?" He said, "Until the challenge is dismissed. Weeks, maybe 2 months." She thought about it. She thought about the contract. She thought about Yiwon crying quietly in the corner of a registry office on a Thursday afternoon. She thought about what the man had asked her to do, and what she had agreed to, and what it meant to follow through on an agreement made with someone who was no longer alive to see it honored. She said, "I have conditions." He said, "Name them." She named them. He agreed to all of them. She made him sign a document addendum right there in her doorway, standing at her kitchen counter, witnessed by the building's security guard who was very confused but professional about it. Then she packed a bag. And she walked into the Shin family compound. And she did not walk in as his wife. She walked in as the help. That had been Chul's strategy, and she had, after argument, after pushback, after making him explain it 3 different ways until she was satisfied the logic held, agreed to it. The challenge was legal, but it was also tactical. The Shin relatives were watching the compound. They had people watching for any sign that Chul was scrambling, improvising, manufacturing a marriage that hadn't existed before the clause became relevant. Any wife introduced now, in the immediate wake of the funeral, would look like exactly what she was, a legal move, not a real marriage. But a woman who had been in the household for weeks. A woman the family had seen, spoken to, dismissed. A woman who could be shown to have been present, quietly, consistently, in the background of this family's daily life, before the challenge was filed. That was different. That was a marriage that had been real and private and modest, the way Yiwon had always lived, because Yiwon had always believed that the most powerful things in his family were the things nobody made a show of. So Natasha went in as a housemaid. And the Shin family, Chul's grandmother, Madam Shin, his uncle, director Shin Byung-rak, his cousin Jai-soo, who moved through the world with the specific aggression of someone who has always known they were in second place and has decided to make everyone around them feel it. The Shin family accepted this entirely. Because of course they did. Because they looked at Natasha and saw exactly what they expected to see. And that was their first mistake. Let's talk about what 6 weeks inside that compound actually looked like. Let's talk about what Natasha absorbed while she was on her knees. Madam Shin was 71 years old and had spent half a century perfecting the art of cruelty through manners. She never raised her voice. She never said anything that could be directly quoted as an attack. She operated through implication, the slight pause before answering a question that communicated that the question itself was below standard. The way she looked past Natasha when giving instructions, as if addressing the wall behind her. The comment made to Jai-soo, just loud enough, about how some people carry themselves without any understanding of the space they are in. Jai-soo was worse in the direct way. She left things for Natasha to find, a glass knocked over, a cushion stepped on deliberately, a piece of jewelry left in a place it shouldn't be, and then questioned loudly at dinner. "Has anyone seen my bracelet? The gold one? I left it on the hall table," looking at Natasha the entire time she said it. Director Shin Byung-rak ignored her entirely, which was its own communication. And Chul. Chul was the most complicated part. Because he was not cruel. He was not warm. He was, and this was what she spent 6 weeks trying to correctly name, guilty. The particular guilt of a man who has agreed to something that he knows is not right, even if it is necessary, and has decided the only way to survive that knowledge is to not look directly at it. He didn't look at her directly. At dinner, the rare evenings she served the family's meal, he looked at his plate. When she moved through the rooms he was in, he found reasons to leave. When they passed in the hallway, his eyes went to the wall. She filed that away. She filed everything away. Here is what she learned. She learned that Madam Shin had been the architect of the inheritance clause challenge, not the uncle. Director Byung-rak was a follower, her instrument, not her partner. He had gone along because the family's alternative future, the one where Byung-rak's branch of the family gained influence, had been offered to him in language he couldn't refuse. But the strategy was Madam Shin's. The lawyers were Madam Shin's. The timeline was Madam Shin's. She learned that Jaisu was more afraid than aggressive. Underneath the casual cruelty was the specific panic of someone who had been promised something for a long time and was watching it potentially disappear. Jaisu had been made to expect, Natasha suspected, by Madam Shin herself, that if the challenge succeeded and Chul lost control of the company, Jaisu would be positioned to benefit. It was the promise that had bought Jaisu's participation. And Jaisu was not entirely sure she trusted the person who had made it. She learned that Shin Global had a second set of books. Not illegal exactly. Legal but structured in a way that anyone who understood international corporate finance, and Natasha did, precisely, would recognize as designed to obscure. Subsidiary arrangements, internal transfers, the kind of architecture that is entirely defensible as long as no one asks the right questions in the right order. She learned who had built that architecture. She learned that it was not Yiwon. It was Madam Shin. On the 40th day, something happened that she had not planned for. She was in the garden at 6 in the morning. She went there every morning early, before the household woke, because those 30 minutes in the garden were the only 30 minutes in the day that were entirely hers. She sat on the stone bench near the back wall, and she thought, and she planned, and she let herself be, for half an hour, not a maid and not a wife, but just Natasha. He was already there. He was standing near the far wall with his back to her, a cup of coffee in his hand, looking at nothing in particular. He turned when he heard her footsteps. They looked at each other. For 6 weeks they had been in the same house and had not once been alone without the architecture of the performance between them. He was the family's son. She was the help. Those roles had walls, and the walls had been useful, and for 6 weeks both of them had stayed carefully on their own side. In the garden at 6 in the morning, there were no walls. She almost turned around. She didn't. She sat on the bench. He stayed at the wall. The silence between them was the particular kind that has weight, not uncomfortable, not empty, but full of things that hadn't been given words yet. He said, "Do you come out here every morning?" She said, "Yes." He said, "I didn't know." She said, "You weren't supposed to." He looked at her coffee cup. She had brought one out from the kitchen. He looked at his own. And then he walked across the garden and sat on the other end of the bench. Not close, 2 feet of stone between them. They sat there for 20 minutes. They didn't say much. He asked if the room was adequate. She said yes. He said the garden was the only part of the house he actually liked. She said she understood why. He asked how she was managing with his grandmother, and she paused for long enough that he said, quietly, "That bad." She looked at him. She said, "I have handled difficult rooms before." He said, "That doesn't mean you should have to." She held that sentence, filed it, said nothing. When she stood to go in, he said, "Natasha." It was the first time in 40 days he had said her name. She turned. He said, I know what this is. What it isn't. I want you to know that I see it. What you're doing, I see it. She looked at him for a moment. She said, I know you do, and she went inside. She sat in her room for 10 minutes before her shift started, and she did something she had not done in 6 weeks. She let herself feel it. All of it, the loneliness, the weight of the performance, The particular exhaustion of being unseen by a house full of people while one person in it was suddenly, inconveniently, paying attention. The thing she had not planned for, the thing she could not file away. 10 minutes. Then she stood up, put the armor back on, and went to start the morning. Day 43. It was a Saturday. The family had guests, 3 of the Shin relatives' allies, the kind of men who come to family compounds in expensive cars and stay for 3 hours and leave having quietly communicated something that never gets put in writing. Natasha served the refreshments. She moved through that room invisible, efficient, and she listened. She heard the name of Yi-won's corporate lawyer, a man named Attorney Park, who had handled the will and the filing and the original marriage documentation. She heard him discussed in a way that made the small hairs on her arms stand up. She heard Madam Shin say, in the particular quiet tone she reserved for things she was absolutely certain of, that Attorney Park had been persuaded to reconsider the timeline of certain documents. She heard the man across from Madam Shin say, "Are you certain of the dates?" She heard Madam Shin say, "Completely." She understood, in that moment, what was happening. They were going to contest the marriage documentation. Not the marriage itself. The dates. They had gotten to Attorney Park. They were going to argue that the filing had been backdated, that the marriage had not occurred before the challenge was filed, that it had been manufactured after the fact, that the documentation Natasha and Chul had submitted was fraudulent. If they succeeded, Chul didn't just lose the inheritance challenge. He faced criminal fraud charges. And she, as his wife, as a party to the documentation, faced them alongside him. She set down the tea tray. She walked out of the room. She went to her room, sat on the edge of her bed, and thought for exactly 4 minutes. Then she picked up her phone and made the call. Not to Chul's lawyers. Not to Chul. To someone the Shin family had never heard of. Someone they could not have prepared for. Because Natasha had spent 6 weeks inside this compound filing everything away, and what she had filed, very carefully on day 19, was the identity of the notary who had processed the original marriage documentation. The government notary. The civil servant. The one person in the chain of custody of those documents who was not affiliated with any private law firm, who had no relationship with the Shin family, who had simply done her job on a Thursday afternoon and stamped the form and entered it into the government registry where it had been sitting, immovable and official, ever since. She called the notary's office. She explained what she needed. She was professional and clear and precise. And then she called Chul's lead attorney and told him what she had overheard and what she had just arranged, and the attorney was quiet for a moment and then said, in the tone of a man who is rapidly revising his assessment of a situation, "How long have you known about Park?" She said, "I suspected on day 22. I confirmed it on day 31. Another silence. He said, "And you didn't tell us." She said, "I was waiting until I had the counterweight." He said, "And now you have it." She said, "Now I have it." She chose Sunday dinner. Chul's lawyers had wanted to do it through official channels, a letter, a court filing, the quiet legal move. She had listened to that argument fully, considered it, and rejected it. She said, "The Shin family has spent 6 weeks looking at me and seeing nothing. I want them to be in the room when they find out how wrong they were. I want to watch them understand it." The attorney said, "That's personal." She said, "It is." He said, "I'm not sure it's advisable." She said, "I didn't ask for your opinion on that part." Sunday dinner, the full family, Madam Shin at the head of the table, Director Byung-rak on her right, Jaisu beside him, 2 other relatives who had joined for the weekend. And Chul, who had been told, that morning in the garden, in the 20 minutes they had sat on the bench together while she explained exactly what she had found and what she had arranged and what was about to happen, and who had listened to everything without interrupting, and who had then been quiet for a long time, and who had finally said, "You've been doing this the entire time." Not a question. She said, "Yes." He said, "The books, the secondary structure, Park, all of it." She said, "Yes." He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" She said, "Because you were already carrying your father's death and your company's future, and you needed to focus on the legal challenge. I handled the part I was equipped to handle." He stared at her. She said, "Also, I didn't fully trust your lawyers not to move too fast and give them time to cover their tracks." He said, "You didn't trust my lawyers." She said, "I trusted my own preparation." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "My father knew exactly what he was doing when he found you." She said, "He was a smart man." He said, "He was." They sat in the garden for a few more minutes. Neither of them said anything else. But when she stood to go in, he stood too. And this time, when she turned to go in, he fell into step beside her. They walked into the house together. Sunday dinner. Natasha served the first course. She moved through the room exactly as she had for 6 weeks, quiet, efficient, present without being addressed. Madam Shin was telling a story about a property in Jeju. Jaisu was on her phone under the table. Byung-rak was eating with the focused energy of a man avoiding a conversation. She placed the last bowl. She straightened. And she said, "I'd like to say something if you'll allow it." The table went still. Madam Shin looked at her. The look she had been giving her for 6 weeks, past her, through her, the look that said what you are does not require my direct attention. Madam Shin said, "Excuse me." Natasha said, "I'd like to introduce myself properly, since I've been here 6 weeks and we haven't done that yet." Byung-rak frowned. Jaisu looked up from her phone. Chul, at the far end of the table, was completely still. Natasha said, "My name is Natasha Adjora Shin. I am a qualified attorney specializing in international corporate law. I have been practicing for 4 years. I am also, as of 7 weeks ago, your son's legal wife." The room did not simply go quiet. It went a different kind of quiet. The kind that happens when the floor of something shifts and everyone at the table feels it, but no one has yet moved. Madam Shin said, "What did you say?" Natasha said, "We were married in a civil ceremony 7 weeks ago. The documentation was filed with the government registry that same day. I have the registration number, the notary stamp, the witness signatures, and a certified copy of the marriage certificate here." She placed the folder on the table. She said, "I also have documentation of the financial structure that was built into 3 of Shin Global's subsidiaries between 2019 and 2022. A structure that I believe the board of directors is not fully aware of. And I have a record of every communication between this household and Attorney Park over the past 3 weeks." Jaisu's phone slid off her lap and hit the floor. Nobody moved to pick it up. Natasha said, "The challenge to the inheritance clause will be dismissed. The marriage predates the filing by 17 days. The government notary has confirmed the original documentation and will testify to that timeline if required. Attorney Park's attempted interference has been documented and reported." She looked at Madam Shin. She said, "I have been in this house for 6 weeks. I have been in every room. I have been invisible to all of you in the way that certain people are always invisible to people like you, which means I have seen everything you did not think to hide." She said it without anger. That was what made it land the way it landed. Not a performance, not a speech. Just a woman stating facts in the order they occurred. Madam Shin said, "You have no idea what you are." Natasha said, "I know exactly what I am. I am the woman who scrubbed your floors and listened to your conversations and documented everything I heard. And I am the woman who saved your son's company while your family was trying to take it from him." She paused. "And I am the woman you called the help." The silence was complete. Chul stood up from his end of the table. He walked the length of the room. He stopped beside Natasha. He said, and he said it to Madam Shin, to Byung-rak, to Jasa, to every person at that table, he said, "My wife has already said everything that needed to be said. The lawyers will handle the rest. Dinner is over." Madam Shin did not speak to either of them for 3 weeks. Jasa left the compound on Monday morning with her things, which was not a surprise. What was a surprise was the letter she slid under Natasha's door before she left, handwritten, 3 lines, saying that she had not known about the plan to corrupt Attorney Park, and that she was not asking for anything, and that she was sorry. Natasha read it twice, filed it, did not throw it away. Director Bahungruk made one attempt to negotiate. He called Chul and made an argument about family unity and the long view and the importance of not airing things publicly. Chul listened to the entire argument. Then he said, "I'll have my lawyers send you the terms. You should have your own lawyer review them before you sign." And he hung up. The inheritance challenge was dismissed on a Tuesday. It took 11 minutes in the hearing room. Natasha had built the counter case so cleanly that the opposing lawyers could not find a seam. The financial structure in the subsidiaries was presented to Shin Global's board in a closed session the following week. Natasha presented it herself. She sat at that table with 12 Korean board members who had expected the CEO's new wife to be decorative, and she walked them through 7 years of documentation in 90 minutes and answered every question without notes. One of the board members said, after, that it was the most thorough presentation he had seen at that table in 15 years. She said, "Thank you. I've been working on it for 6 weeks. Here is what the legal and corporate record does not show." It does not show the conversation they had 3 days after the Sunday dinner, when the house was finally quiet and the lawyers had gone home and Madam Shin had retreated to her suite, and it was just the 2 of them in the kitchen at 11 at night. He made tea. She sat at the counter. They were both too tired for anything that wasn't honest. He said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer without thinking about what the right answer is." She said, "I always think about what the right answer is." He said, "I know. That's why I'm asking you to stop." She looked at him. He said, "When my father asked you to do this, when he explained what it was and why and what you'd be walking into, was there any part of you that said yes for a reason that wasn't in the contract?" She was quiet for a long moment. She said, "Your father told me about you, not the public version, the actual version. He told me that you had been alone your entire adult life, not because you didn't want connection, but because every person who had come close to you had wanted something you couldn't separate from who you were. The money, the name, the company. He said he didn't know if you would ever find someone who could see past those things." She paused. "He was worried about you, not the company, you." Chul was very still. She said, "And I thought that a man his father worries about like that must be worth something. Must be real in some way that the Forbes covers don't show." She looked at her hands. "That is not a professional consideration. That is not in any contract, and I'm aware that it complicates things. But you asked me to be honest, so there it is." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "My father was right about you." She said, "Your father was a smart man." He said, "I said that." She said, "You did." Something shifted, small but real. He said, "What happens now, with us? What do you actually want?" She said, "I want to not make a decision about that while we're still inside the crisis. I want to wait until the legal case is closed and the board has settled, and we've both slept properly for more than 3 days in a row." He said, "That's a very reasonable answer." She said, "I'm a very reasonable person." He said, "You infiltrated my family's house for 6 weeks and built a legal case in secret while scrubbing floors." She said, "And?" He said, "That's not reasonable. That's extraordinary." She looked at him. He was looking back at her, and it was the first time in 7 weeks that neither of them was performing anything. No roles, no walls, no contract language between them. Just 2 people in a kitchen at 11 at night who had been through something together and were only now beginning to understand what it meant. She said, "Ask me again in 30 days. He said, "I'll ask you in 29. She said, "That's childish." He said, "Probably." He slid a cup of tea across the counter to her. She wrapped her hands around it. The kitchen was quiet. The part of this story that took the longest to resolve was not the legal challenge. It was Madam Shin. The woman did not apologize. That was not in her architecture. What she did, and Natasha would later describe this as the thing she had least expected was asked to meet. Alone. No lawyers, no Chul, no witnesses. Natasha agreed. They sat in the formal sitting room, the same room where Madame Shin had looked past her for 6 weeks, and Madame Shin poured the tea herself. That was already unusual. She handed Natasha the cup and then sat back and looked at her directly for the first time. She said, "My son, Chul's father, was not the man that most people believed he was." Natasha said nothing. She waited. Madame Shin said, "He built something extraordinary, and he protected it from everyone who tried to take it, including me." She paused. "I thought that after he was gone I believed the company should have been differently structured from the beginning. I believed Bahungruk's branch deserved more than it had been given. I believed," she stopped. "I believed I was correcting something unfair." Natasha said, "And now?" Madame Shin said, "Now I am looking at the woman my son's father chose to protect his son, and I am thinking about what it means that he went outside this family to find her. What that says about what he thought of us." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "You could have gone further, the subsidiary documentation. You could have made it public. It would have been significant." Natasha said, "I know." Madame Shin said, "Why didn't you?" Natasha looked at her and said, "Because Chul would have been collateral damage. His company's reputation, his board relationships, his first year of actual control, all of it would have been complicated by a public scandal about his grandmother's financial engineering." She paused. "You were wrong, but destroying you publicly would have hurt him, and I was not going to hurt him to be right." Madame Shin looked at her for a long time. She said, "He married well." Natasha said, "He had good help." Something happened in the old woman's face. Not quite a smile. Something more complicated than a smile, the expression of someone who has spent a long time being certain and has just discovered the particular exhaustion and relief of not being certain anymore. She said, "Will you stay?" Natasha said, "That depends on what staying means." Madame Shin said, "It means this is your home, not on any condition, not with any role assigned. It means what it should have meant from the beginning." Natasha said, "Then yes, I'll stay." 29 days after the kitchen conversation, he knocked on her office door. She had an office now, full corner office in Shin Global Tower. Her title was General Counsel, a title she had negotiated with the precision of someone who understood exactly what it was worth. The board had agreed with the particular efficiency of people who had sat in a room and watched her work and decided that disagreeing was not in their interest. He knocked. She said, "Come in." He came in. He was in his CEO clothes, the kind of quiet expensive that his father had also worn. He closed the door. He said, 29 days. She said, "I know." He said, "I told you I'd ask early." She said, "I remember." He said, "So I'm asking, what do you want? Not what makes sense, not what the contract says, not what's strategically advisable." He looked at her. "What do you actually want?" She looked back at him. She thought about a Thursday afternoon in a registry office. A handshake, a garden at 6 in the morning, 53 things she had filed away, a cup of tea across a kitchen counter, 29 days. She said, "I want to find out who you are when nobody's in danger." He said, "That could take a while." She said, "I have time." He crossed the room. He did not shake her hand. The Shin family never fully recovered its internal cohesion, but then it had never truly had it. Byung-rak signed the terms. Jaisu moved to Busan and started, quietly, a very small catering business, and Natasha, though no one would ever know this, made one phone call on her behalf that opened one door, because she understood the difference between the person who built the trap and the person who was caught in it. Madame Shin lived in the compound for 3 more years. She and Natasha never became warm, but they became something that was perhaps more durable than warm, honest. They disagreed about things, directly and with full sentences, which was more than the old woman had done with most people in her life. Natasha respected that, eventually. And Madame Shin, eventually, respected everything. Chul ran Shin Global for 20 more years, and was described in every profile written about him as someone who had fundamentally changed how the company moved in the world. He was always slightly more interested in giving credit to his general counsel than the journalists expected. And Natasha. Natasha built what she had always said she would build, a life that could not be made helpless, not by circumstance, not by someone else's decision. She just had not expected that building it would include a garden bench at 6 in the morning and a cup of tea across a kitchen counter, and a man who asked her what she wanted and waited, without filling the silence, for the actual answer. She had not planned for that part. She was glad she hadn't. If you watched this all the way to the end, you already know this channel is different. This is not a quick story. This is not a shortcut. This is the full thing, the betrayal and the strategy and the reckoning, and the part after the reckoning that nobody writes about. Subscribe if you are not subscribed, because the next story is already written and it is called The Interpreter, about a Nigerian woman hired to translate for a Korean chairman who realizes, on the third day, that she's been translating his private conversations to his enemies for 2 years. And the twist, she was hired by his son. The story drops next week. Like this video, not for me, for the next person the algorithm sends here. The one who needs this story today without knowing it yet. Hit the bell. The next one is worth showing up for. See you then.